Good afternoon and welcome at the Midweek Catch-up webinar. I'm Linda van Tilburg, and today we have a real political discussion about the future of South Africa. Well, just to recap, most of us thought at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic that Cyril Ramaphosa has got this. You know, he was praised for how he was handling it, for his early lockdown. And it also looked as though the pandemic might present the perfect excuse for him to actually fast-track the reforms that the business community have asked for so long. But a couple of my fellow South Africans, those famous speeches later, it appears as if the new dawn is even further away than it was before. The president allowed some of his senior ministers to rule the roost. The illegal trade in cigarettes were booming, and earlier this week that we heard that somebody in his office may be linked or resigned because there is a link between her and some of the illegal things that have been going on in the Gauteng with the procurement of PPE. So the question is, where is this heading? I mean, everybody seems to be angry and cynical at the moment. And how will he be judged in future? Well, today we've got two very well-known analysts with me. Let me start with Ralph Mathekga. He's a political analyst and very well-known in South Africa, and he's author of When Zuma Goes and Ramaphosa's Turn. We'll ask him if it's still Ramaphosa's turn today. And we also have the CEO of the South African Institute for Race Relations, or the IRR, Dr. Frans. Ralph, of course, is also a doctor, and he's the author of the newly published The Rise and Fall of South Africa. Well, before we get into this discussion and let our panelists speak, we just want to ask Stuart Lohman, our general manager. Stuart, everything working today? And people must please, ask questions and send me their questions, because we're going to have a little bit of intro and then allow the business community to ask the questions. All okay, Stuart?
Excellent, thanks, Linda. Just quickly, for those listening, can you see three pretty faces and hear my voice? And there's a little presentation underneath there. There's a little high five button on your control panel. If you give me a high five, we know we're coming through loud and clear. There we go, Linda, we got some high fives there. And as Linda said, we'd like to keep it very conversational. Little questions drop down on the control panel, put them in there, and Linda can pass them on to the relevant panelists. But yeah, have fun, everyone.
Well, before we start of how this is going to pan out in a future election, because elections are a bit further away, but it's sort of, if I'm correct, and I will ask you too if you agree, this is one of those things that happen to governments that normally you don't have real figures of successes and failures. Parliament, they can say we raise the standard of living, we've more kids in school and stuff. But actually, with COVID-19, governments will be judged by probably the death rate. So is this a critical moment in time where the ANC, with its massive background of corruption and which literally erupted again this week, or you could say President Cyril Ramaphosa acted quickly to stamp out what was maybe going on with somebody in his office. Is this a critical turning point for South Africa? Can we start with Dr. Frans, please?
Linda, hi, and Ralph, very nice to see you, sir, as well. Yes, it is, Linda. It's a critical turning point. In the midst of all of this, we published a book titled The Rise or Fall of South Africa. The "or" is a very critical part of that title. And that book was sent to its publishers in November, 1 month before Wuhan. And we wrote in the book that we used the word fragility a lot, and said that if a major geostrategic shock washes through the world now, the consequences could be to set South Africa up for a political realignment on a scale of what last happened in the 1980s and 1990s. And 1 month after that, we had COVID, and that is the shock. And indeed, it's a catalyst that I think will bring about a realignment this decade on a scale with what happened here in the 1980s and the 1990s.
Ralph?
Thanks, Linda, and good day to my colleague, Frans. I think that, one thing that came to my mind when the COVID-19 pandemic came about, and I want to go back to what you're saying, that this is just a catastrophe that is difficult to deal with. The thing with COVID-19 is that you cannot spin it, and you just can't, because death is the most certain thing. that we live with. That one we know. So someone cannot be half dead, cannot be relatively dead. They're either dead or they're alive. And this is the challenge with dealing with a phenomena such as this, which has got this kind of certainty when it comes to the consequences. So any kind of government that went into this pandemic with a crisis of legitimacy, there are only two things that you are likely to come out. You're either going to have to buckle up and get your act together, surprisingly regain legitimacy as government and do the right thing and point to result, or you are going to try to spin this thing, you're going to try to spend your money on public relations, and you end up with people dead, and this thing will just go down with your leadership. This is where the problem is, the way in which I see this one. And when I look at South Africa, it's a very interesting case. The public relations is amazing. I mean, South Africa seems to have a very interesting relationship as well with the World Health Organization. That makes it look like South Africa knows what it's doing. But you go deeper into our response, President Ramaphosa's response to this, it speaks a different thing altogether. You get off the public relations nightmare, you start seeing what's going on the ground. You go to Tembisa, you go to townships where we go, many other areas, you realize that government actually has lost control of this. So that is just the fact on the ground as I see them, Linda.
So I'm sort of saying we're giving a scorecard to Cyril Ramaphosa today. As you said, there's a total different perception overseas than here. So how is he faring? How can we say what he's doing now? How do you got both of you view his success and failures at the moment?
Linda, you said in your introduction there was the sense that he had this. I don't think there was really such a sense. Not in, I mean, perhaps in the public domain and in some of the mainstream media. But beneath that, I don't think there was such a sense. I think there was from the beginning an appreciation that given the decade of Mr. Zuma, and then given the period since Nasrec, and the very slow, to be generous, moves towards any kind of reform, that the consequences of any long-term lockdown in South Africa would be catastrophic. And we saw early on, for example, that countries that were introducing lockdowns with some success were countries that were bringing to bear levels of stimulus roughly 20-fold greater on a dollar basis, on a per capita basis, than what's happening in South Africa. And the economic devastation that would be wrought by the lockdown decisions taken in this country, on the back of the fragility from which South Africa entered COVID, a function not just of Zuma, but of the counterproductive policy decisions taken, including by Mr. Ramaphosa since Nasrec, that the consequences would be catastrophic. And my colleagues yesterday released a report on consumer trends for South Africa with data virtually up to date on the COVID consequences, and I described that in a note to clients, some of the contents of that report, as arguably the greatest socio-economic reversal that South Africa has suffered in living memory. And I think there is a great detachment between the tenor of some media reporting on Mr. Ramaphosa and his efforts to date, since Nasrec and on COVID, and the actual reality of more of the data becomes available.
Okay, I see, Frans, you're breaking up a little bit. Okay, can you just repeat? Can you just repeat what you just said?
I think that in the coming days and in the coming weeks and months ahead, as more of this data becomes available, the complete scale of the catastrophe that's been engineered since Nasrec and compounded by the mistakes made on the virus and the lockdowns will be revealed. And on the whole, I think that observers are underestimating the socio-economic impact that this will have, the depth of it, and the later political consequences that it's going to come about. This is an inflection point for South Africa, and and the consequences and what will flow from this, I think, offer up, we'll get to it later, events and results that I think few firms or groups invested in South Africa now properly appreciate the significance of.
Ralph, do you agree? Do you think?
Well,
that...
Yes, Linda.
No, please go ahead. So do you how do you think he's been doing?
Oh, he has been doing very badly. I mean, from Nasrec, I'm one of the people, of course. Frans, we've discussed this even before in our writings and everything. The big problem has been that he has not been able to realign the ANC. I mean, Linda, as you and I are speaking, you've got a member of parliament who is a suspect, who is heading a committee of correctional services, which is supposed to be in the security cluster. And this is happening, it has happened since Nasrec. We have seen the two groups just agreeing on deployment. It was more like factions going into deployment. It had nothing to do with the strategy of the party. It had nothing to do with the vision that the cabinet was going to implement. It had a lot to do with the compromise around power. So there's not been any realignment. And actually, the sad part is the risk of a further democratization of corruption under President Ramaphosa. I mean, I often say under President Jacob Zuma, things were a bit pedestrian. I mean, if you want to look at corruption, it was not sophisticated. People took things that were not attended to. But now you have under President Ramaphosa a group of sophisticated people. I wrote in my book when Zuma goes that we will not see the end of corruption. We are most likely to see even a more sophisticated corruption that is not illegal. So the repercussions is a politics that is characterized by tensions. I'll agree with Frans on that one, that protests tend to be the order of the day. But even beyond protest, it's just radicalization of South Africa's politics, where the EFF just start growing and almost becoming a party at the center of policy influence. And given their position, it just tells you that you have South Africa's politics that will be moving much more towards a radicalization path. You no longer have consensus at the center of policy dialogue. You have a winner takes all. We win the land debate, and if you lost it, you lose everything. It's not about coming up with a policy that one can say still reflect that center politics that South Africa, I think, or the ANC had committed to much earlier. So the repercussions politically are quite severe. And I think this is one event that has a potential to really shake the functioning of our body politics, to bring about measure or to induce measure realignment in our politics in a way that we are drifting further and further from center politics or even from the solution.
One of the questions I've been sent, somebody said, but is it fair to blame Ramaphosa for everything? He inherited this from Zuma, and it finds it difficult, to turn it around because of the politics in the ANC. And also, did he not show by immediately acting on what's her name, Kusela Diko in his own office? Didn't he show that yes, he is serious about it?
Linda, fair and unfair is, I think, neither here nor there. It is what it is, and that's one level of answer. The other answer is it doesn't fly that he inherited from Zuma. He was Mr. Zuma's deputy for a decade. He was party to every decision that was taken, and he has subsequently, remember, it was the Zuma caucus in Parliament of the ANC that voted against expropriation. It was the Ramaphosa caucus that voted in favor. Mr. Ramaphosa champions structural youth unemployment, South Africa's effective youth. It's a populist and deeply counterproductive decision. And I'm afraid that the track record on policy making since Zuma is not great at all. And you can trace that populist decision making all the way up to the present, the 100% full taxis, the closure of schools. It's fairness, you can argue one way or the other, but the buck stops with the head of state. He is in charge, and the political and economic consequences are not good. And I go back to where I'm trying to take this conversation a little bit later this morning, that the consequences of this are going to be to fundamentally change the lived experience of every South African and every entity with interest in South Africa for the next 20 to 30 years on a scale far greater than I think they appreciate at the moment.
Ralph, can we ask you, well, to also elaborate on that, but also somebody asked, and I think this is be good, you'd be good for this. When are South Africans going to accept responsibility? He says this government is there because we voted them in power. We asked for this, and when are people going to start thinking of the consequences of their vote? And this is a question from Merrick Grenfell. So we're getting back to what is the consequences in coming elections.
Well, let me start with the idea that the excuse that we keep on making, even some of us analysts, we keep on making this excuse that, oh no, President Ramaphosa is constrained within the ANC, he cannot do anything, we've got to accept that he's trying to search consensus and so forth. Of course, the reality is that no one forced the president to activate an integrity ticket. And actually, he ran a campaign that within the ANC, he ran a campaign that deliberately drew people from outside the ANC into taking an interest into what was happening. It is the first time that we have seen an internal campaign of the ANC that was run much widely outside the party. So in the first place, he presented himself as an option, not just within the ANC, but he crafted that integrity ticket that he waved to South Africans, saying that, look, I'm standing on this, I'm going to fight against corruption. And I remember even going into the elections last year, there were the views that people were voting for the president and not the party. I was quite puzzled by that, because in our system, you don't vote directly for the president. But there is a sense in the election that he managed to carry the ANC while it was experiencing difficulty in these elections where it dipped below 60%. So I do think that he should take responsibility. And I think that we cannot make an excuse to say he inherited the ANC. President Ramaphosa is not an outsider. And again, I'll go far back and say that he's not a stranger to factional politics. His own ascension to lead the ANC was actually a vote against President Motlanthe, who then was contesting the position of being a deputy. And President Ramaphosa accepted to harvest an angry vote within the ANC. And so we're not talking about someone who's completely innocent here. We're talking about a politician who understands the ANC and who cannot keep on saying he's surprised about how bad things are within the ANC. He's not an outsider, he's an insider in all respect. And I want to believe that it is all his own responsibility to be able to take the party forward. And again, the ordinary, and I'll give you a chance, Frans, the question of ordinary people, how they vote, what are their options and so forth. Of course, I believe that people do have the options, and I do believe that it comes down to how people vote. But I also want to acknowledge the constraints that the South Africa's political system impose on the options that people do have. I mean, people vote for political parties only. Maybe people will be able to vote for individuals. I don't know if those part of reforms that we need will be able to increase a sense of choice when it comes to how people actually vote.
Okay, I'm just going to see. I've somehow my camera is switching to I think only on.
Can I jump in on your question?
Yes, yes, of course.
Quickly, this thing of how people vote is very important. I think people are taking responsibility to a far greater extent than is understood. There's such a poor understanding in South Africa. Ralph and I lamented collectively of actual hard political data and information. There are now more people who do not vote, who are entitled to vote, than the number of people who vote for the ANC, number one. Number two, many of those people do not vote because they are lazy or uninvolved. What they see hasn't been across the opposition divides. There hasn't been much that's been terribly compelling in recent years to vote for. And some of my young analysts say, for example, that people who don't vote are actually the best political analysts in the country. We also now see that amongst younger people, and it's true, Ralph laughs, but it's right, Ralph. You know,
it's true. It's true, Frans. So true.
You know, there's not much support for the radical populism of the EFF, given, you know, the EFF gets about 18% of the vote of people under the age of 30. Now, in that bracket, about half of people don't have a job. That doesn't show you the strength of the EFF. It actually shows you the magnanimity and moderation of the great majority of young excluded people in the country. It's a far more moderate society than EFF support suggests. We now see that amongst younger people, ANC support is really at around 49 to 51%. It's flirting in that bracket. And that's in a country where only 35% of people are over the age of 35. The ANC support is only at 57% nationally because of the disproportionate influence of older voters who vote for the ANC, not because they are stupid, but because they appreciate the extent to which the ANC improved the country after it came to power and improved their lives, a perspective younger people don't have. And the ANC did make things better. You know, the number of people with jobs did double in the ANC's first decade. 10 formal houses were built in that first decade, that gear era, for every shack newly erected in the country. The proportion of families without electricity was 50% when the ANC came to power. It was 20% by the time Mbeki left. So I think South African voters are incredibly pragmatic, very well informed, very moderate in the main. The liberation loyalty voting is not a phenomenon. What drives voting patterns is pragmatism and the material circumstances of people. Apply a shock like COVID to that voter base, and what you actually begin to create, and I'd be very interested in what Ralph thinks on this, is our clients tend to say to us, well, who's going to benefit from this? Is it the EFF or the DA? And we say, you're looking backwards to try and see into the future. What the answer may be is a new idea, a new party, a new movement that will appear to the center right, which is where public opinion tends to resonate in South Africa. And I will suggest to you this morning that by the end of this decade, South Africa may be governed by a group and a movement with people who, a party that doesn't exist at the moment, pushing what we call controversially a black conservative agenda. And the very small little steps towards that, I don't think he's going to make it, but he'll leave the example on the battlefield, is Herman Mashaba, a capitalist, anti-racist, and thinks the state should be out of your life. And he's a populist, slightly right-winger with his chase the immigrants out of the country. Sort of, if he was in America, his slogan would have been build a wall. And I think that's where we're headed as a consequence of.
Okay, I'm sure you want to respond to that, Ralph.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I like what Frans is saying. You are getting us thinking here. I'll even go further and say that there is even a chance for that, conservative forward/Christian kind of value system party that is going to come out. I mean, liberation politics just don't define South Africans entirely, because South Africans are very conservative. I mean, we go out there in many areas. There are some people out there who are concerned about some of the things that are being decided even at the center. There are people, Frans, who think that the debate on abortion is not sealed. There are people out there who will bring some of these things back to politics, and they will be organized around these things. And again, you see, the problem of our history, and I'm glad, Frans, you raised this, the problem of our history as a country that always look at race in a binary way, as if black people just means not conservative. We fail to understand that there has never been a mobilization of a conservative voting ticket among the black people, and I believe it's there. I'm working on a book that part of it also looks into that, and also looking at the dynamism of rural areas as well, rural vote. People always think that rural areas, they just vote unnecessarily. Those are the maximum bargainers. They vote like me if I were to look as to who's giving me tax break and so forth, they look at what is possible, and they are not idiots. They're not going to vote for one person that they know is not going to control council anyway, and that vote will end up being a wasted vote and so forth. You look at the way in which they are voting, they are pulling back the vote, they are not giving it when they are unhappy with the ANC. I agree, Frans, there we have seen towards local government election in the north of Pretoria, the impoverished side of Pretoria, Winterfeld. I spoke to a lot of journalists. Majority of poor young people are withdrawing from voting. They are not going anywhere. They are not going to the EFF because those are the people that when you speak to, they are not sufficiently radicalized. Some of them believe that they might run businesses. It's just a question as to whether the policies that we have, are we going to continue incentivizing that? Are we going to nurture the idea that still exists among the poor? Because if you speak to the poor in South Africa, they are not mentally destitute. You speak to them, they believe this thing can work. They believe they can be businesses. They are not they refuse to be radicalized. And my question that I always put forward is, one way or another, if we do not push social justice, if we don't make it possible for the poor to experience socioeconomic, I would say migration, if you like, from the poor to middle class, one way or another, someone is going to fully radicalize them. At this point, political parties are failing to radicalize those people. It's just a question as to which party can actually activate them. And I'll fully agree, Frans, that South Africa is very complex, conservative, lobby, rural, half Christian, and so forth. Those are some elements of political identities that I think have not yet fully been explored away from the liberation politics. So we might see very exciting points. And Mashaba, very interesting, the language he speaks, he's actually saying that, look, I've not been part of the political dynasty, but I'm going to weigh in. That culture, I think a lot of people might see that you can actually have a voice in South Africa without being part of the political dynasty of the ANC, for example.
Yes, sure, by Frans.
Linda, around the world, where the center left or the left loses, who's winning? It's not other center left that's beating it. Go right around everywhere. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Poland 2 weeks ago, Modi in India, Kagame in Rwanda, Johnson in the UK, Trump in America. This is the center right to the populist right that's winning. And so many of our clients fear that the South African move is by default to the radical left. The next great neo-Marxist case study and catastrophe. Something we urge them to consider, and our data is very strong on it, is that would be at odds with public opinion, and it would be at odds with a lot of global precedent. And that's where I'm sort of going this morning with you, is what's happened, that we felt in the book is what's always going to happen. COVID has simply accelerated that book prediction by a couple of years. And Ralph is right, it's a very exciting moment to be at. If South Africa remains a free society in which people and their desires and wills choose its government, then at the end of this decade may see the country end up under new management and in remarkably good shape as a consequence.
Well, when we've talked about opposition politics, and that's some of the, because you obviously, and both of you have said that, if I'm correct, that a new opposition would come. It's just where it's going to come from. But are you guys saying that the DA is definitely not, they're not doing it, they're not going to be able to reform sufficiently to be the official opposition and eventually take power? And that's a question I've got from, I'm just going to see who it was from. Ralph?
Yes,
Ralph,
the DA, I mean, they're in trouble. And I think that one of the challenges that the DA continue to deal with, whether it's fair or unfair to them, it's a question of the historical legacy. I mean, if you look at the DA now, you look at the people around the DA, and you look at the racial part of it, yes, they are quite leaders from different communities, but still, even if the DA can demonstrate to you by the figures that these are the top leaders that we have, and we are transformed and so forth. We are a party for modern South Africa. You still have this thing. It is almost an intangible historical burden, if you like, that always seek to say to the DA that, look, here is the issue that you always have to look at. Even if they can, they make policy proposals where they are saying that, look, we don't want to be looking at the question of race as a decider of how we think of policy intervention. They always get drawn to that. And the question for me is, will the leadership of the DA be able to shift the DA from having to spend a lot of time on that, or is the DA beyond salvage when it comes to whether can this party come back to the center politics? I mean, my biggest concern, Linda, it is the collapse of center politics in South Africa, because where I studied politics, where I understand politics, I believe that it is at the center politics there where compromise is possible, where maximum returns when it comes to policy outcome for majority, for the well-being of the people, I think it is possible. And I think that that is where at that center where I think the payoff is more. Any extreme shift to the right or the left, I think it's just problem. And I see the DA's response sometimes to the ANC's radicalism, just at times the DA coming out as just the opposite of that. So it is a difficulty that, and I think it is a genuine problem. I often say that it is a genuine problem. How do you move from 22% towards being a governing party? What do you change and what do you retain? It is a genuine problem. The question is, are they responding better to this problem? And I think the jury's out there.
Okay, I'm sure you want to respond to that. Frans?
Yeah, look, a lot of South Africans like to hammer the country's politicians, many with good reason. But the few decent people out there, some still in the ANC, some still in the DA, who choose a life of politics when they have other options, deserve our grateful thanks. And the DA is very important because it's got a few of those people in it, and the parts of the ANC also have a few of those people in it still. But on the whole, the DA has had a torrid time, and climbing out of that is going to be very difficult for it to do. But will it beat the ANC was the question. Govern South Africa one day? I don't think so. But does that mean it is not important or so? No, not at all. I think it can play a very important role in firstly getting South Africa to the halfway house of coalition government, which is where we may very well be in a few years' time, 2024. And out of that, supporting what may then become a majority in such a coalition, or in fact a new majority party movement thing. It might not be a party in the traditional sense of the word, that may lead South Africa with great success through the second half of this decade and into the 2030s. But I try to get away, we try to get our clients away from the idea that you know, the choices are the ANC governs, or the EFF sort of takes it over and governs, or the DA sort of beats everyone and governs. All have a place in the analysis, but the anticipating events is aided greatly by thinking that none of those boxes are going to be the ultimate position, and we're going to find something new down the line. That is really difficult to imagine, you know, and it's such a hard thing to do as analysts. I think Ralph agrees that if we failed, and I speak now as the Center for Risk Analysis, which is a function within the older IRR family. If we failed our clients in any respect in the last 10 years, we've never really forced them to take seriously the advice we were offering. And that goes back to anticipating the collapse of Mbeki. It goes back to anticipating the horrors of Zuma, which weren't properly appreciated at the beginning. Anywhere, the likelihood of Zuma of losing, and then the fact that even though Zuma lost, Ramaphosas didn't actually, he won, but he didn't win. He was never going to introduce reforms. Dr. Dlamini Zuma might as well have won, and wouldn't be in a fundamentally different position as a consequence. And now I'm faced again with this, that we're trying very hard to get clients to anticipate that it's not going to be necessarily the existing players. And the catalyst for that is this not the virus. I think the virus, as is now ever more their effect on the health of people.
Oops. Sorry, Frans, you're breaking up a bit. Can you just repeat that sentence?
I drift out for a second or two sometimes. And I was just saying that the catalyst for that is this event that South Africa's been through in the last 3 months. Not the virus. That's wrong. This virus, its effect on the world, on global health, initially was grossly exaggerated by various modelers and forecasts and analysts. South Africa particularly bad. If you compare the excellent work done by Panda to some of the advice given to the South African government. The virus didn't bring this about. What brought this about was the government's response to the virus, but it was going to happen anyway. We were the ANC after Nasrec, in fact, after Polokwane, Ralph, I'd argue, after Polokwane. That was the peak point. That was peak ANC. The election probably in 2004, when the ANC was, Linda, 6 percentage points stronger than when Mandela had led it to freedom in 1994. I mean, that was its peak. And after that, as the tide turned on Mr. Mbeki, partly through his own doing, you read peak ANC, and now the slide and the fall away, and the consequences of that, much bigger, deeper, longer, further than I'm able to make many of my clients appreciate and understand.
Okay, so shall we get to some questions? Somebody just asked, Ivor Fletcher said, what comes after Ramaphosa when he goes? Is there any chance of the ANC changing? Ralph, would you like to start on that?
Well, you see, the question is, first of all, based on the presumption that in the next elective conference of the ANC, there'll be measure change, new people and so forth. And that is not going to happen. If there is any chance of the ANC changing, it will be very gradual. What happened after Ramaphosa? I'm not even sure if he's going to have the second term, because we know that within the party, to be able to end the second term, you just cannot go against your comrades in government. You see, the ANC is structured in a way that the system makes it very impossible for anyone who wants to end the second term from within the party to do anything meaningful in government that could have implications for the political fortune of some of the senior party members that are entrenched within the party. So it is a pipe dream that Mr. Ramaphosa could go after the corrupt and still expect people who control the branches, some of whom are going to be dead. And again, I also want to throw a disclaimer like Frans did. There are great people from within the ANC, no doubt about it, but I don't think their voice is so dominant that one can say they are pushing against institutionalization of corruption within the ANC and how the whole process of electing leaders, it is being questioned by very senior members of ANC who make remarks that votes have been bought and so forth. So I often say, yes, Mr. Ramaphosa can have the second, President Ramaphosa can have the second term. The question is, at what cost to South African? I mean, we know that his presidency at Nasrec as well, the cost that it came to South African, it was for him to compromise. He's compromising with some of people that are considered to be former President Jacob Zuma's allies. So what comes after him? I'm finding it very difficult to spend a lot of my time rethinking about the ANC, where it will be in 15 years, Linda. I don't know whether it's a useful exercise for anyone, that I want to focus my mind of what is going to be after the ANC, because I don't really see the ANC. There is a possibility that South Africa's solution might not involve the ANC to a point where I think it might not matter who is the president of the ANC after Ramaphosa. I mean, if we are going into these coalitions, which I think that's where we are going, it wouldn't really matter much. I mean, we need to start framing also South Africa, construct the politics of South Africa, sometimes even away from the ANC. It is nearly impossible because of how overwhelming the party is. We always think about self-correction and so forth. But for me, I really think if a student came to me and said to me they are studying where the ANC will be in 20 years, I'm going to ask them, who's going to read your thesis in 20 years about the ANC? Because it might just not be there anymore.
Ralph, spot on. Absolutely, I'm completely where Ralph is. You know, and you can do the analysis, Linda. You take the top 100, so take the NEC and bits of the cabinet and around that, individuals, draw up a list, give them to an intern, and say, come back with the names of the people who would.
Sorry, I think you're breaking up again. Yep. Okay. Are you okay? Yeah. Are you back, Frans?
Back? Yeah, I think I'm back. Here I am. Hello.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I was saying this, that Ralph is right, and you can do it if you take a list of the top 100, so that NEC and the hangers-on and bits of the cabinet, give it to an intern and say, right, come back with the names of the individuals who would support strongly the structural reform South Africa needs to become a competitive society. They won't come back with more than 4 or 5 names out of that 100, and then that's the point. And Mr. Ramaphosa had a strange conjuring effect on people who thought about the ANC, because he would change that entirely. And he didn't have the ruthlessness of Mandela, that Mandela used at Davos in '92 to change. That's 23 years by that point since its conference in 1969. There's the famous ANC policy conference in Morogoro, where it turns tact quite sharply to the radical left. Mandela turns it right back at Davos with pure ruthlessness. Mr. Ramaphosa is trying to seek consensus. It's never going to fly for him. So I think the tipping point is behind them for the ANC. The demise is probably inevitable now. And the question that needs to be asked more and more, not what will the ANC do with South Africa, but what will be done with South Africa when the ANC no longer has the majority to do it. And if you're well positioned on the answer to that question, then I think you're pretty robustly positioned to do well out of South Africa's next decade and a bit.
Okay, well, this leads on into what both of you have said. This is a question from, I'm just going to say, because somebody was talking about, are we mature enough? Oh, it's Merrick Renfell again. He says, are we mature enough to manage coalition politics? Can you describe your vision of the transition? I see the view that another party may run the country over the next decade, but what between then and now?
A slightly shambolic 5 or 6 years of coalition. You know, if you can't hold it together in Port Elizabeth, you're going to struggle to do it in the union buildings. But in that, something else. That I think if you think of South Africa as, on a macro level, if you think of it as a unitary state run out of Pretoria with a government that determines what happens, you're probably not seeing what it's going to be like. Far more likely is that as the coalitions will be a bit shambolic, and what the effect will be, think of it this way: the authority of the state will begin to retreat until, to exaggerate the point, the government governs over the union buildings and the gardens around the union buildings. But outside, beyond that, more and more, I think you'll see what we call a fragmentation, where communities take upon themselves, to a lesser or greater extent, what was once the functions of the state, or simply, as the taxi industry did a week or two ago, 3 weeks ago, just say, you know, to hell with your COVID regulations. We're going to load 100% and try and stop us and get away with it. So I think if you're thinking, who will govern in the sort of traditional way that there'll be a group in the union buildings, they make policies that determines everything that happens to South Africa, I don't think that's good, what the country's going to be like. It could be a far more fragmented society, where institutions, communities who take responsibility onto themselves, established almost quasi-parallel states. And we've made great advances towards that already. Middle-class communities living in walled villages, really the medieval model. Linda, a great stat is that in 1994, there were about 100,000 policemen, boots on the ground, not clerks and things, and about 100,000 security guards. And now South Africa has, I think, about 180,000 boots on the ground policemen, but approaching 600,000 security guards, security officers, staff in the private sector. Now, the classic definition of the state is a monopoly on the use of force or violence in society. That's already been surrendered to the private sector. South Africa is far further down this road of fragmentation. To be a central tenant. It's really what we're seeing. Okay. Last point, Linda.
Okay.
It's a test of the decision on union 110 years ago. And I think that is what is starting to give way. The idea of Pretoria will decide is falling away, and it's whoever governs or leads the ANC might become less relevant in your future than your own ability as a community or a sector of the economy to take previous state responsibilities into your own sector. I stop there. Thanks, Linda.
Okay, Ralph, do you want to comment on that, or should I move into another question?
Oh, a very quick one there, and I think Frans is raising a very important issue here. I mean, I've been studying communities maybe excessively, and I can tell you, Frans, that already in some of the rural communities, people are resuscitating traditional leadership authorities and giving them much more power to run communities because local government is just rotten. I mean, it's failing. So you have communities already indeed organizing themselves. And I believe that this is an area where a lot of us researchers, we need to be focused on, Frans, because we need to start framing how South Africa will look like. I'm already seeing a lot of court cases because I think that as the ANC is losing legitimacy at central government level, it is going to push more towards centralization, which will result in many court cases where I don't think the DA is going to allow the ANC to redemarcate provinces into 4 regions that the ANC run, because when you are losing power generally, we have seen it in most cases that when a party loses power at a central level, where power is dispersing, because democracy generally is about the dispersing of power. Democracy generally does not favor heavy centralization, and we know that we have favored heavy centralization politically here. So I'm seeing more dispersing of power, Frans, as you're saying. I'm seeing communities coming out more, but I'm also seeing a lot of court cases where the provincial and your regional versus national powers are being redemarcated, because I think people are going to want more power at their doorstep, except for security and so forth. Because what's the point of having government that has got a competency on something that affects you right on your street, and government is too far? So I think naturally you're going to see further decentralization. And I have to say, if someone were to ask me, is this good for South Africa or not? Of course, from the point of view of those who believe in centralization, they will tell you that we need to build a unitary state with a central planning. And for me, I say that you are just centralizing malfeasance and you are just collapsing the state. If you decentralize, people manage their communities very well, people get involved, you are more likely to see better performing institutions than the centralized one. That is my take on that. And I know it is a controversial subject as to how far do you really go in maintaining, how strong you go in terms of federalism in South Africa. And I think we're moving more and more towards more federal. I think people just want more power about their own affairs, I think.
Well, the changes that they were talking about, the Electoral Act, would probably help that as well. This is a question from Robert Bronze. He says, is the ANC going to lead the country into total ruin? It's always the question of, are we going to become what Zimbabwe is, or are we actually seeing a change of new government in time that leads the country away from what he calls this total corrupt government?
Well, I mean, on a block, yeah, a deficit of 700 billion rand this year, unemployment rate approaching 40%. You know, the thing about total ruin is there's not a bottom. As societies that fall into total ruin demonstrate, there is no floor. You never hit the ground. You just keep going. On South Africa, though, I think two things are very strongly in our favor. The first is that we have a reasonable prospect of remaining a free society in which people have the ability to take decisions about who governs them. And that will remain the case if the property rights question remains, if property rights remain intact, because they anchor substantive human liberty in every free society, and where they go, civil rights go just afterwards. So if we remain a free society, and if public opinion remains moderate and conservative, as it is at the moment, then yeah, as the government fails to deliver through the process of voting, something new will take its place. It's almost inevitable, and that will happen at the same time that this fragmentation happens, and it would sort of become de facto more federal, even though it doesn't happen on its.
Yeah.
Optimistic, therefore, and my that South Africa into the end of this decade will show strong signs, both of this de facto federalism emerging and of a new political movement beginning to emerge at the center, driven by this moderate centrist opinion. Don't for a moment believe what you read on Twitter about South Africa and the type of country it is, or what you read in a lot of the mainstream big news online platforms, BizNews being a very important exception to that. You guys are great. South Africans actually get on pretty well. They respect each other across lines of class and race to a far greater extent than many activists will have you believe. And they remain committed to, the polls show this. We're not making this stuff up. The numbers are there, the reports exist. South Africans want essentially the same thing. They want to leave rural areas, come to cities. They want their kids to be in great schools so the child can have a better life than the parents. Their parents want to own something that's theirs, a home, an asset, and build up wealth, and through their own hard work see their lives improve. And as long as that remains the case, we remain a free society, we will get through this, and the end of the 2020s will start looking a lot better. Okay,
Ralph, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, very shortly. One thing that I'm always proud about South Africans is that they don't easily reject. They are not rejecting a market society. South African, irrespective of the rhetoric in some of the politics, South Africans usually are saying that all they want is an opportunity to be able to partake in a market economy, and there is no one here at the middle who is rejecting the system that we have. So I will agree with Frans there that there is a commitment to basic freedom. And the big problem that people have is with government, actually. We don't have an ideological issue in this country here, in this country, France. Usually people have a problem with the delivery of basic services with government. And this is how sometimes government articulate its failure by pointing out to historical problems, as it is always the case with the politics and so forth. But if you look at ordinary people, you look at how they are framing their problem, you're not going to meet a black South African saying the reason I'm poor is because of a white person. No, they are very practical. And I think that there is much more, I would say, there is less tension at a human level than there is at institutional and political level. So for that, it gives me a sense that people will remain engaged, and people will continue to realize that their well-being is interdependent on each other. I mean, sometimes you listen to the news in South Africa and you think that the country is burning down sometimes, but you go there, people are getting along. You go to the farming community and so forth. It's not as sometimes you hear at policy level discourse. So that is one thing I think that is still quite positive about us.
Okay, I've got a lot of questions still, but there's one specifically about the economy before we go to summarize. The root cause of this issue, says Jack McLeod, is the economy totally destroyed by corruption, the non-delivery of service, the money was squandered and plundered. Who do I vote for that can offer honest dedication to serving all sections of South Africa? I'm being naive, but I would vote for someone with values. So I think both of you covered this, but
Jack, he was referring to someone on this planet. I beg your pardon. Well, let me just say there is no perfect vote, Linda. I mean, I do understand. I think that sometimes in some of the elections, you can vote for someone who does not have a plan, but maybe they just want to correct the wrong, stick with them for a while, and maybe later on look at someone who has a proactive plan. The reality is that you just, I mean, the type of a figure that is being explained, who do I vote for, values and so forth. I'm not being cynical, but I'm just saying that you're not getting that. It's just looking for maybe the closest you get. You know.
Okay. Well, we're getting sort of to the last 5 minutes. Can we sort of summarize? So we seem to think, if I've got both of you correctly, that there might be a shift, that people might not vote for the ANC. Somebody says, in the meantime, how do we get the ANC to listen to us? Can we get either of you just, you know, what did we do now? Because the next election is quite far away.
Yeah, how do you get the ANC, Frans?
Oh, thanks, Ralph.
Please help us here, Frans.
The answer to be you faded for a second. I'm just pausing to be back in hearing. There we go. I think to be pragmatic, Linda, the answer is that the ANC has had its opportunities to listen. It did so very effectively in the early 1990s. It achieved more than it was given credit for. If you argue that it was pragmatic, I say to you, budget surplus, 2007, 2008. I mean, that's arch fiscal conservatism in Western capitals. We did it here. We cut debt to GDP in half. But the events of December 2007 set it off on a trajectory that is now coming to its inevitable conclusion. There was a window at Nasrec to turn that. In preparing for this, I actually read my sort of track record on Biz News. And it's very interesting because Alec interviewed me in January of 2018. And he said, what do you think? And I said to him that Ramaphosa has the power now, which he had. He definitely had it, to do the reformation, if he chooses to use it. And I said that 2 or 3 times, if he chooses to use it. And in June, I spoke to, I don't know, I wrote something, or you interviewed me again. And I said, in fact, that I won't find it now as I look for it. I said they'd blown it. Yeah, he'd blown it, was the quote from June 2018. And in blowing it, what he'd done is he'd thrown away the last window to listen to that pragmatic majority. That if he had listened to, would have seen ANC support rise to above 60% in the 2019 election and sustain those levels as the ANC captured the imagination of younger people and capitalized on the shenanigans, the problems that were occurring in the DA over the last 3 years. To listen now, no, but the worst excesses of the state capture factions in the ANC and the ideologues can be successfully resisted via effective activism and a little bit of legal action and so on. But to my conclusion for you has to be that the ANC that listened came to an end with the demise of Mr. Mbeki, now more than 10 years ago.
Okay, Ralph, we've got a minute left. So what are we going to see more protests like the anti-Zuma protests? Quick answer there, please.
Yeah, indeed. I think we are going to see more protests, but not necessarily anti-Ramaphosa. I think what we are likely more to see is just tensions around service delivery to a point where the president will find it difficult to ask people to be patient.
You agree, Frans? More protests, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. No, these relationships are very well established. The proportion of protests in South Africa that are violent has increased from 9% at the end of the Mbeki era to 30% a year or two ago. The correlation between protests, popular confidence in the future, living standards, job creation, these things all exist. Yeah, we'll see an escalation in protests, but protests are just a holding pattern for people who can't find anything to vote for. And politics, like water, it finds a line of least resistance. And as soon as there's a compelling new political alternative, your protest movement will dissipate, and you'll see that movement grow much faster. And you heard it here first than anyone thought was possible. Linda, thank you very much from me. Thanks to Best News. Ralph, great to see you again. And,
with that, I have to sign it off. And thank you so much. And it was actually, I'm surprised you guys agreed more than I thought you would, but it was a nice debate as well. Thank you so much for joining us and the business community. The ones I haven't answered the questions, I hope some of them overlapped. You can always contact these lovely gentlemen and ask their opinions. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye from the Midweek Catch-up webinar.
Thanks, Dor.